Greetings everyone, I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you can tell from my title up there, I'm continuing my trek through the era of animation known as the Disney Renaissance. This, of course, is the first entry in it, and like a lot of things that begin eras like this, it was more unintentional that it started a movement, but history knows it as the first entry, and that, of course, is the 1989 classic, written and directed by John Musker and Ron Clements. This, of course, is The Little Mermaid. This is my old VHS copy of it, and of course, this copy is notorious for the controversy about a certain part of the image. If you see it, you see it. And of course, that's an old ad thing they did. This thing I love about the VHSs. Now, this is a film I watched a good amount of times when I was a kid. I have not watched it in 2+ decades at the time I'm recording this, and having revisited it via Disney Plus to see how it looks in HD and widescreen, I can say I really wish I had watched it a little bit more after that, because it's a film that I did like. You can definitely see the more modern leanings when it comes to adapting the fairy tales, beginning with this one, and stuff that they would continue on with Beauty and the Beast, with how they take the classic formula and tweak it to update it slightly. You can definitely say its beginnings there. Now, this film, like Beauty and the Beast, actually has its roots back in the early days of Disney animation. But for one reason or another, the plan just fell through following Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And of course, it would stay dormant until actually 1985. So when we're really into the Dark Ages. This is when Ron Clements actually became interested in directing it, because he discovered a copy of the Hans Christian Andersen story in a bookstore, and he's like, this would actually make a good basis for a story. So he took it, read it, and then did a pitch, and actually presented it to Jeffrey Katzenberg at one of his meetings. And Katzenberg initially was like, I don't know, because at that point they were developing a sequel to their smash hit Splash, and they thought, oh, it's going to be too similar. But then, of course, soon Katzenberg relented, and they like, alright, after we do Oliver and Company, you can do your film. So they started developing it, starting with the 20-page rough outline, and from there it went into further developmental stage, and that's when they decided to include a Broadway style song structure to it. Now, the reason I bring that up is that with this film, if you were to watch all of the Disney animated films in sequence from the first one to the last one, this is where you would really notice the change in how they did their musicals. Because a lot of the early ones, they had some good musical numbers, but they did not have that same feeling as a musical number would have. Let's say you go watch a Broadway musical, where it has that bombastic, because even the softer numbers have a certain bombastic quality to them. Like, compare Broadway numbers like Sit Down John, Phantom of the Opera, My Friends, even the stuff from the musical Peter Pan. Compare that to some of the early musical numbers, at least with the animated films. Maybe some of the live action ones you might be able to get it, but like My Prince Will Come, Actor's Life for Me, Love, they don't really have that same bombastic quality in their original form. Maybe covers might, but in their original form. With this one, this is where you start to get that one. And it is something that has really remained. Whether you like the songs in the more recent films or not, that bombastic Broadway quality has stayed there. And I think that's part of the reason why a lot of the songs in this film, especially since it started that trend, are memorable. Because think of it. You got Part of Your World, Under the Sea, Poor Unfortunate Souls, Kiss the Girl. That's 4 hit songs. As a one-off in a film, any one of those would be Oscar contenders, but all 4 of them are in the same song. Excuse me, all in the same film. And they all help with something. Like Part of Your World sets a precedent for subsequent Disney musicals, with the protagonists vocalizing their desires early in the film. We see that continue on with Belle and Beauty and the Beast. Pocahontas in her film, and even I Can Go the Distance in Hercules. Now, even I can't wait, just can't wait to be king, even does that. And then, of course, the villain song, Poor Unfortunate Souls, definitely sets the archetype for that. Excuse me, not the archetype, sets the stage for that. Sets the mold. And not every villain would have it, but Gaston, Be Prepared. And then, of course, probably my favorite Disney song, Hellfire. All of them. In addition to Musker and Clements, Alan Menken worked on this film. He did this score, and of course he would also do the scores for Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Tangled, and he even helped write a song for Rocky V called Measure of a Man, which that film gets slipped on a little bit, as does that film, but that is a good song, I feel. And of course, he collaborated with Howard Ashman on the songs, and they would do so until Aladdin, because he sadly passed away in 1991, and it is that collaboration that, of course, brought that bombastic Broadway style in here. And you could definitely feel both of their fingerprints on here. Menken, you could really feel a lot of his fingerprints in the scores of the films he did, but this is where you can really feel it, and that little musical fingerprint actually begins at the beginning of the film. Now, the nice way to segue into the plot, because the plot is adapted from the Hans Christian Andersen story, but it does what a lot of these Disney movies that are based on fairy tales do, where it takes the core aspect of it, adapts it, and adds some of their own Disney flair. And in this one especially, the happy ending, even though I've heard mixed things about that whole thing in the story. Now, it begins, we're on a boat. This is where we're introduced to the Prince character, Prince Eric, who is voiced by Christopher Daniel Barnes. His men, they're returning on a trip. And of course, we get a fish that goes overboard, and this is a nice way to segue into the undersea world. We're eventually introduced to the undersea kingdom ruled by King Triton, who is voiced by Kenneth Mars, which, retroactively, this is my introduction to Kenneth Mars, and I had no idea about it at the time. And he does an excellent job voicing the king. And the king, he has his many daughters who are performing musically, and this is supposed to be his youngest daughter's debut. And surprise, surprise, she's not there. She's actually out exploring a shipwreck because she is fascinated with the human world, despite King Triton telling her to stay away from them humans. They're nothing but nasty fish eaters, which of course goes along with all of the undersea kingdom's bias against humans. And of course, I guess to them, fish eater would be a racial slur, or some other type, or I guess you could just, racial would work. Undersea people versus land people, so I guess that whole thing still works. As we get that amazing scene with the shark, with this scene alone, this is where you can tell that they really are going 100% forward with the animation on this film. I mean, they started out with the previous two, but with this one, just from the introduction to the undersea kingdom and then the shark attack, those two scenes alone, you can see why this is considered the first of the Renaissance. And you throw it on top of scenes we see later. Now, Ariel is of course scolded by her father, like, you need to stop being fascinated with the human world and you need to stop going to the surface. Well, she doesn't listen. She goes up to the surface and sees the humans celebrating a party. It's actually because it's Prince Eric's birthday. They're celebrating with fireworks and music, and she gets fascinated, and she sees Prince Eric. Based on his demeanor, his behavior, and his looks, it was love at first sight for her. Now, she saves him because a storm comes up, basically sinks the ship and knocks all of them out of the boat. She saves Prince Eric. Eric sees her as she's singing. And of course, he wants to find out who she is. And Ariel, in going with part of your world, decides that she's got to find a way to be part of his world. And this is in the little reprise moment of it, where, she's up on the rock and then the wave splashes over her. Nice little set piece of animation there. And of course, eventually King Triton finds out that she's in love with a human. And of course, this leads to the one moment that when you watch this film as a kid, you're all on Ariel's side, but then when you watch it as an adult, you're like, okay, I understand King Triton here a bit more. Or she's arguing, I'm 16 years old, I'm not a child. And you watch it and hear that, and you're like, damn, no, you're not. You are a child still. You still got a couple more years. Even though when you think about it, there's not really much different mentally between a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old. They might be experienced, but even then, Triton, being the overprotective dad he is, you kind of see where he's coming from, but his bias against the land, it's one of those things, it's like, wow. They only bring it up a little bit. They don't really overplay it. It's just enough to where it plays into his overprotectiveness. But there's a lot there you can read into it, especially with the fish eater comment, like I've already addressed. Now, King Triton really puts his foot down, destroys her collection that we see in the Underworld number. And Ariel is approached by Flotsam and Jetsam, the minions of our main villain, Ursula, who is voiced by Pat Carroll. Now, Ursula, we've seen on and on in the film up to this point. She's watching, and she has a plan. She has a history with King Triton that they don't really go into other than they dislike each other, which I think is enough considering the runtime of this film. What is the runtime? 83 minutes, so a little bit over an hour, and it goes at a quick pace. So you got to go from point A to point B to point C quickly. So not really delving into it. If this was a more modern film, they probably would delve into it a little bit, but 89, you kind of can get away with them not going into it as much, but there's enough subtextual stuff there where you can imagine it. Could be a past relationship, could be relatives of some manner that they just don't address the relationship. Well, Ursula offers Ariel a deal in order to get Prince Eric, that she'll make her human for 3 days in exchange for her voice. And Ariel decides to agree, signs the paperwork, and completes this Faustian transaction with Ursula. And this, of course, is during the Poor Unfortunate Souls number. And all throughout it, Carol's performance on this song, you can really tell that she is going on the Faustian side of things. And even if Ariel doesn't quite believe her, it's worth it to try to get to marry Eric. Of course, she ends up in the human world, runs into Eric and his caretaker, who is, I'm looking for his name on here, Grimsby, who's voiced by Ben Reitz, who of course also voiced Roger in 101 Dalmatians and Rama in the Jungle Book. This being his last role, he died 4 months before the release. Kind of can feel his age a little bit in his voice. And they cover the next 3 days pretty quick. You can tell that he's trying to figure out who she is because she can't talk. And of course, the Kiss the Girl number, that's when you can see that Eric is starting to develop feelings for her a little bit, but he's denying it to himself mainly because he wants to see the one who saved him, which it's like, if you can't really tell there's a similarity, maybe you hit your head harder at your father, you were that delusional. I mean, even Grimsby is like, in one scene, like, why search for the girl of your dreams like that when you could have what's right in front of you? Due to a shot of Ariel up in the window combing her hair. And for a lot of the scenes here, a lot of cute little moments, it is literally fish out of water when you think about it. I mean, we use the term fish out of water to describe someone we put in a situation where they don't understand things, like Thor at the beginning of his first solo film, He-Man and his film, and other little situations, but this is literally a fish out of water. And of course, with how she interprets human objects based on her interactions with her main bird friend Scuttle, you can imagine things are not going to go well at first, but of course they show her the error of her ways. And of course, with the Kiss the Girl number, you see the real dark side of Ursula's deal coming in it, because she has some sabotage thrown in. And of course, she's not going to be playing fair. She wants to win. And she takes it a step further and uses her magic to impersonate Ariel in her own human guise, using her voice. And then, of course, they have to interrupt a wedding, which this is the other controversial moment, which, since I did not watch this one, I didn't really notice it, but there's the whole thing of how a certain religious person is drawn to where it looks like he has a certain foot out during the ceremony. Now, of course, they've all said it's supposed to be his knee, which, based on how tall he is, I can see it. But it's also one of those things that, like, yeah, you should have made that animation a little bit clearer. Is what it is in the copy on Disney Plus, it is edited out. I mean, the scene is still there, but they kind of edit that line out, and it goes a little quicker than I remember it being. Now, we get a big show off against, showdown, against Ursula, because she, Sundown goes on her deal, steals power after making another deal, and of course our hero has to prove his worth and defeat her, and it's very quick. Some of the films that follow the showdown usually last a good 10 minutes. This one was maybe like 5 tops. Watching it, I'm like, hey, this went by quicker than I remember. And again, a lot of the scenes in this movie were going by quicker than I remember. Even the jump from one musical set piece to another really went by quicker than I remember it being. But then again, that just shows how long ago it was I watched the film last. And of course, this being the first in the Renaissance, you kind of can forgive it a little bit for being quick like that. Now, of course, it does have a happy ending where Ariel and the prince end up together, and part of that is with Triton completing his arc, where he sees that humans are not all bad. And that is a good ending arc for him to go with, that he sees that maybe he misjudged them. Now, considering what he said earlier about them eating fish, and of course the implication that those might be fish that he knew, the whole tree bird situation, it's like, that's a little quick turnaround. But then again, there's also the other thing of, like, especially with how Jack Triton is, what do they as mermaid people eat? Are they saying that they themselves don't eat any type of fish or whatnot, even though they live under the ocean? Or is it okay for them to eat fish, but screw those people when they eat fish, fuck them? It's just one of those things of like, maybe I'm just thinking too much on it, but it is one of those things. And of course, unlike the book, where in one of the endings she turns into sea foam because she does not win, but then again in that one there really is no villain. So the whole thing with the deal ending, it's not because of a villain interfering, it's because another love interest comes in and legitimately steals the prince's affection. So taking out that whole little chestnut and then turning what remains into a plot by the villain, and then having love conquer all. It's a very Disney-esque vibe, but it works here. It's where they're taking the whole classical formula and updating it for the then modern time. And it works, just like how it works when they do it again with Beauty and the Beast. And I think that's actually their best take on it. Now the animation, like I mentioned in the overview, all throughout the 70s and in the early 80s, you can really see when they were reusing animation. Of course, it had the more stripped down style, which for some of those films it works. But here, in the wake of the previous 2 films, it is nice to see them start to re-up the animation again. And of course, this is when they're working in a little side studio away from the main building, so they're off on their own, away from Jeffrey Katzenberg going down their throats, so they don't have to worry about, to use the term that the older studio people would use, about man being in the forest. So a little bit more left to their own devices when it comes to what they're going to do with certain shots and all that. So Musker and Clements have slightly more free reign. Now, like I mentioned already, some of the voice acting. Of course, we got Jodie Benson as Ariel. Classic job there. Barnes as Prince Eric does a pretty good job. I mean, his character, it's not the most deeply written character when it comes to a Disney romantic lead, but he does have a bit more going for him than, let's say, Prince Philippe. Where is it? With Philippe, the only reason I was rooting for him when I revisited that is because he's the good guy. Here, and this is all mainly due to Barnes' interpretation of what is written, I do like him. As he comes off as an actual Prince Charming. He used that term. Of course, Pat Carroll's Ursula. Perfect casting for this villain. And then I already talked about Kenneth Mars, and we got Samuel E. Wright as Sebastian the Crab. I mean, you really do feel that he is the court musician, that he is Triton's right-hand crab, and he does want to help do what's best for Ariel, even if it is to save his own shell. But he does kind of view her as like a surrogate niece. Maybe that's how Wright is selling it with his portrayal. And then, of course, the Jamaican accent he uses for the character. I don't know if that's his real voice, I'm assuming maybe, but even if not, it's a convincing enough one for me. And there's a warmth to his performance, even when he's being more pompous. And of course, we got Jason Moran as Flounder, Ariel's best friend. I mean, his performance, I mean, you really believe them as friends. Buddy Hackett is Scuttle, the comic relief character. I found him a little annoying, to be honest. That's one thing that didn't age as well looking at it. Especially the lead in to Kiss the Girl, but you gotta have a comedic lead in there. And of course, I think we're all thinking what Sebastian's thinking in the lead up to it. I gotta do this myself. I think the scene there's two moments that I didn't really mind Scuttle the most, and that is when he confuses the dog and Prince Eric, and then of course when he leads the charge against human Ursula. That's a moment it's like, yes, go get her. You're a seagull-like thing. Crap on her. That would have been funny. And of course, leading everyone, including the sea lion. And of course, Patty Edwards as both Flotsam and Jetsam, creepy voice. I already talked about Ben Wright. And then in a minor role as Louis the Cook, the French stereotype, we got the late great Rene Auberjonois. Of course, known to people who grew up in the 90s as Odo from Star Trek Deep Space Nine. I always find it fun whenever he pops into something I'm reviewing. Here, you can't really tell it's him because he really goes into that French accent. You can kind of hear a little bit of his normal voice there, but it's mostly his French accent. Like I said, stereotypical character, but it's good for comic relief and adds a bit of dark humor to it because he is singing a song about how much he loves to cook fish. And in any other context, this would just be a normal cook song. But what makes it dark is the fact that he's singing about cutting open fish, ripping out their guts in front of a humanoid crab. And Sebastian is watching this in horror. And to add to it, there's some crabs of the same species as him that have already been stuffed. So he's basically watching someone play with body parts of animals he could know, some animals he could be related to, and it makes him want to vomit, and he almost does at one point. This would be like if being a human character in like a Texas Chainsaw Massacre film and walking in to the back of Leatherface's shop and seeing all the body parts spewed about and some of them being turned into sausage, and then smelling some of it being cooked and all that. Or to use a scene that actually exists, that certain scene in the first film which you realize is it's people. And that's why I say it's a dark humor bit, a moment there when you realize how you can connect the dots with it. Or maybe that's just me because I'm a sick fuck, but it was fun, that moment. And then of course his little fight with the chef. And of course he gets a big moment at the very end. That's all really to put there. Now, Katzenberg, in the months leading up to the release, he cautioned the makers of this film, being like, yeah, it's going to make some money, but it's niche because it's a girl film. But of course, as it drew closer, he changed his tune, and that was probably due to him watching it and being like, maybe not. And of course, hearing that, I'm like, girl film? I mean, it's a fairy tale one, and the lead is a female character, but the way the film is presented is not anyway a girl film. And even then, that's such a stupid comment to make. I mean, even just looking at it from an anime perspective, there are anime that are targeted more at a female audience that males like. Sailor Moon. Thing that got me into anime. Then again, that's probably the older studio mindset there, and I'm saying older is including those who would have been like newish in the 80s and all that. Of course, the film, critically, find big hit. A lot of the critics liked it, including the ones I don't really hold that much respect for. And it ended up doing alright at the Oscars. It won Best Original Score, and it got 2 nominations for Best Original Song, Kiss the Girl and Under the Sea, which out of all the songs in there, you can kind of see those would be the ones that would attract the Oscars more, even though personally, I think of any of the songs that should have got the nominations, I would say that Part of Your World should have been nominated, but you can kind of see where those ones are, especially Under the Sea, because that's really the one you can listen to anytime, and that's the one that ended up winning, so can't really fault the Oscars for it, but my preference is I would have gone with that one. And on the budget of $40 million for 80s money, it ended up making $235 million. So even when you take Hollywood accounting, the whole double its budget to break even, it made money. And I don't have the figures up, obviously, because I had the article up on my phone. even when you adjust it for inflation 30 years after the fact, yeah, it's still made. That'd be like, if I'm remembering my inflation, that'd be like, if it was made for like around 60 million and it made like 300 million, which, if you look at it from a modern one, would be not as good, but just adjusting the numbers for inflation is still pretty good. And of course, set a precedent for the beginning of the era, set the standard, and Disney was once again off and running, and would continue on into the new decade, the 90s, because this was released in November of '89, and next films would be in the 90s. Now, overall, The Mermaid is still a fun movie to watch. Goes by at a pretty quick pace, and if there's any flaws in retrospect, is that some of the fine tuning that they would do later, you can really tell is still in its primordial shape here, but that is not really a flaw. That's just something from an artistic, creative standpoint you'll notice. If you're not a fan of musicals, the fact that there's a good amount of numbers in this one might turn you off, but I don't really have any issues with the film itself. I definitely want to get the DVD or Blu-ray of it on here because, I like this copy of it. I would like to add another copy of it into the collection down the road, so I don't just have to depend on Disney Plus to watch it. And now, for any parents in my audience group, if you are slowly introducing your kids to Disney films, this is one you can't go wrong with as an initial one. Now, I don't remember what order, but this is definitely one of the earlier ones I watched. I mean, you can see it's the Classics collection, of course. The whole thing about them releasing the films out of the Disney Vault in the 90s, I mean, you can get a whole thing with that. I think this is when they were releasing everything that they released as a classic, which, when this one would have been released, it would have been the mid-90s. So, a little early to be calling it a classic Disney. A decade later, definitely now this you consider this a classic, but back then, no. I mean, I have some other ones over there that I definitely would be considered a classic. Like Jungle Book from the same series. I don't know what happened to my copy of it, but definitely Mary Poppins. That one I watched so much that VHS went haywire. But overall, that's really all I have to say about this film. Definitely comes with my recommendation to watch. Whether you like Disney films, don't like them, definitely one you should watch. If you don't like Disney films and you end up liking it, hey, I'll do you. And of course, next we go to if I remember off the top of my head, the only sequel in the Disney Renaissance, and one of the few non-musicals in it. And that, of course, is going to be The Rescuers Down Under. Until then, everybody.